In a world that grows noisier every day, there is a place made just for you, a place where sacred stories are told slowly, with love, to calm your mind and warm your soul. Here, you will hear stories filled with deep reflections, stories meant to bring you peace, to offer hope, and to gently strengthen your faith. You'll hear about people just like you, people with fears, with struggles, but also with a quiet feeling that somehow everything is going to be okay. Because before sleep, what we need most is not answers or noise, but rest for the mind and comfort for the heart. So now, breathe deeply, settle in, and enjoy tonight's story under the care of God. Before freedom, before the desert winds, before the miracles, there were chains. Not the kind you see on wrists, but the kind that wrap around the soul. The kind that begin in childhood and never loosen. The kind that make a person forget what silence feels like. Because every moment is filled with commands, with whips, with the sound of stone grinding against stone. In ancient Egypt, beneath the golden sun and between the towering monuments of power, there lived a people whose names were rarely spoken and whose suffering was never written in the royal scrolls. They were the Hebrew slaves. From the moment they could walk, they worked. Their hands, small and soft, quickly became cracked and calloused. Their backs bent beneath baskets of clay. They molded bricks under the eyes of men who never smiled. They lifted stone that wasn't theirs, to build cities they'd never enter, for rulers who saw them as tools. They woke before the sun rose. They moved with it across the sky, and only when the stars returned were they allowed to rest, if you could call it rest. Because even in sleep, their bodies ached, and their dreams were filled with walls that never stopped rising. Children didn't play. They learned how to carry water, how to avoid the whip, how to cry without making a sound. Mothers didn't hum lullabies. They whispered prayers, not for joy, but for survival, for another day, for their sons to live past infancy, for their daughters not to be taken. And yet, somehow, they endured. Because even in the deepest corners of bondage, something refused to die. Hope. It lived in the cracks between labor, in the brief glance between two workers who shared a moment of silence, in the stories whispered at night about a God who had once promised to be near, a God who had spoken to their ancestors, a God who, maybe, was still listening. No one said his name aloud anymore, not often, not with confidence. But still, some believed, some waited, and in a small home, tucked away from the noise, a woman gave birth to a child. She looked into his eyes and knew, if she didn't hide him, he would be taken, like so many before him. So she wrapped him in cloth, and she prayed. She prayed not for safety, but for something more impossible, that he would live, and that one day he would walk free. She hid him for as long as she could. For 3 months, she kept him quiet, pressing him to her chest whenever he whimpered, shielding him from passing footsteps and curious neighbors. Every creak of wood, every voice outside the door made her heart freeze. But she never stopped holding him, never stopped hoping. When she could hide him no longer, she did what no mother should ever have to do. She let him go. She placed him in a basket woven with trembling hands, sealed with tar to keep out the river, kissed his forehead one last time, and laid him gently among the reeds of the Nile. And then she walked away. That river had swallowed many dreams, but that day, it carried one forward. A daughter of Pharaoh came down to the water to bathe. She saw the basket, heard the cries, and though she was royalty, dressed in linens and gold, something in her paused, something motherly. She opened the basket and saw the child, a Hebrew child. She should have turned away. She should have followed the law. But instead she reached inside, lifted him into her arms, and said he would be hers. She named him Moses. And from that moment on, he lived between two worlds, He grew up in marble halls and studied the language of kings. He learned how to read, how to speak with poise, how to wear fine robes. He ate from silver, slept on soft cushions, walked through gardens where slaves were never allowed. But every now and then, he looked beyond the palace gates. He saw the laborers. He watched their hands, raw and red, shaping the stones beneath their master's gaze. He heard the crack of whips, the silence of fear, the language they whispered to each other, the same one his nurse had once spoken in secret. And something stirred inside him. He began to notice. He began to remember. And though no one said it outright, he knew. He wasn't born of the palace. He was born of the burden. And that truth would not let him rest. Moses grew, taller, stronger, sharper. But the tension inside him grew too. It followed him through the corridors of wealth and privilege, whispering reminders he couldn't ignore. Every feast tasted of silence. Every garment felt like a costume. He was honored by men who crushed the backs of his people. And one day, the burden broke. He stepped outside the palace and saw it plainly. A taskmaster shouting, a Hebrew man struggling. The whip flashed through the airs and struck flesh. Something inside Moses snapped. He looked left, he looked right, and then he struck. The Egyptian fell to the ground, motionless. For the first time, Moses felt his blood pound not from fear, but from fury. He buried the body in the sand, hands shaking, breath uneven. But you can't bury truth. The next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting and tried to stop them. "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" he asked. One turned to him and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses froze. They knew. And if they knew, so would Pharaoh. He had no choice. He fled into the wilderness, away from the palaces, the comforts, the guilt. He wandered for days, alone, a prince without a name, a man caught between identities. But the desert did not swallow him. It refined him. He found shelter in Midian, where he defended some shepherd girls at a well. Their father, a priest named Jethro, welcomed him in, gave him food, gave him rest, gave him a new life. Moses stayed. He married one of the daughters. He became a shepherd. He learned to live simply. No gold, no thrones, just stars, wind, and the soft sounds of sheep at night. Years passed, enough to make a man forget who he was. But one day, he looked up, and something was burning. The fire didn't move. That was the first thing he noticed. In a dry land where everything burned quickly, this bush remained untouched. Flames rising from its branches, yet the leaves stayed whole. No smoke, no crackling, no ash. Just light. Moses stepped closer. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with something older, something deep, as if the desert itself had paused to breathe. Then he heard it, a voice. "Moses, Moses," he stopped. "Here I am," he answered, without thinking. "Do not come any closer," the voice said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses dropped to his knees. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face. He had grown up with stories, yes, but they were whispers, echoes, old songs sung softly in the dark. But this was real. God continued, "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. I am concerned for their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them, and I am sending you." Moses' breath caught. "Me? I am no one," he said. "Who am I to go to Pharaoh? Who am I to lead them out?" God replied, not with flattery, but with presence. I will be with you. Still, Moses doubted. What if they don't believe me? What if I can't speak well? What if I fail? And to each fear, God answered with patience, with signs, with promises. And finally, Moses surrendered. Not because he was ready, but because he couldn't ignore the call any longer. He turned toward Egypt, not as a prince, not as a fugitive, but as a servant carrying something far greater than himself. A message, a mission, and a promise that would shake an empire. He returned not with chariots or trumpets, but with sand still on his robes and uncertainty in his steps. Egypt had not changed. Its walls still rose high, its masters still ruled with cold hands. But Moses had changed. He walked through the city with eyes wide open, seeing everything now for what it truly was. He found his brother, Aaron, just as God had promised, and together they entered the gates of power. Before Pharaoh, the room was vast, columns carved with gods, floors polished like mirrors. Servants stood silent along the edges, but all attention was drawn to the throne, where a man sat who believed himself divine. Moses stepped forward. "Let my people go." The words echoed through the chamber like a breeze that dared to stir still air. Pharaoh raised his eyebrows. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know this God, and I will not let them go." And with that, the battle began, not with swords, but with will. Pharaoh, offended, increased the burden on the Hebrew slaves. "Let them make bricks without straw," he ordered, "but demand the same number each day." The people cried out, not in hope, but in frustration. They turned on Moses. "You've made things worse," they said. "You've given Pharaoh reason to crush us harder." And Moses turned to God. "Why have you sent me?" he asked. "Ever since I spoke to Pharaoh, things have only gotten worse. You haven't rescued them at all." But God did not retreat. He reminded Moses of the promise. "I am the Lord. I will free them. I will redeem them. I will take them as my own, and Egypt will know that I am God." And so began the unraveling of power. One by one, the signs came. Not all at once, not with fury, but with purpose. Water turned to blood. Frogs rose from rivers. Gnats swarmed the earth. And Pharaoh's heart grew harder. But Moses kept going. He wasn't the same man who once ran from guilt. He stood now with trembling hands, yes, but with a voice rooted in something deeper. Not his own strength, but the echo of a burning bush that would not be consumed. Each time Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, their voices carried the same plea: "Let our people go." And each time, Pharaoh refused. Sometimes with scorn, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a flicker of uncertainty, he quickly buried beneath pride. The plagues continued. Flies filled the air, buzzing like static in the ears of the powerful. Livestock fell sick, their bodies collapsing in the fields under the weight of invisible sickness. Boils erupted on skin, of servants, of nobles, even of priests who once thought themselves protected. The empire trembled, but Pharaoh held on. Then came the hail. It crashed from the heavens like shattered glass, crushing crops, breaking trees, shattering confidence. Fires followed, running across the ground like living rage. Egypt, once green and proud, began to look barren. Still, Pharaoh would not bend. Moses watched as a nation began to crack, not because of war, but because of stubbornness. He saw the eyes of the people shift. Fear was growing. Not fear of him, but fear of the God behind him. And then came the locusts. They swept through the land like a curtain pulled over the sun. They devoured what was left, the final remnants of grain, of hope, of what once made Egypt proud. In private, Pharaoh's officials pleaded with him. Let them go. Don't you see that Egypt is ruined? But pride is louder than wisdom, and Pharaoh's heart remained stone. Then came the darkness, not the ordinary kind that falls with night. This darkness was thick, like smoke, like silence you could touch. For 3 days, no one moved, no one spoke, no one saw the sun. It was as if time itself had been swallowed. Only in the homes of the Hebrews did light remain. Pharaoh summoned Moses one last time. Go, he said, take your people, but leave your flocks. Moses answered with calm clarity, Number, we will take everything. Not a hoof will remain. Pharaoh's face twisted with rage. Leave me. If I see your face again, you will die. And Moses, steady now, replied, You have spoken well. I will not see your face again. The silence that followed was heavier than any plague. Egypt waited. Israel waited. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath. Then God spoke to Moses once more, not with fury, but with finality. One more plague I will bring upon Pharaoh and Egypt. After that, he will let you go. This would not be like the others. This would reach into the very soul of the nation. Moses gathered the elders of Israel and spoke the instructions carefully, calmly, like a man reading from a scroll of life and death. Each household would take a lamb, a perfect one. They would prepare it with care, roast it, and eat it together, standing, ready to leave. They would take some of its blood and paint it across the doorposts of their homes. And when the night came, when the shadow moved through the land, that blood would be a sign, a covering, a shield. That night, while the Hebrews sat quietly behind their doors, Egypt wept. In every home, from servant's hut to palace chamber, the firstborn fell, not by blade, not by hand, but by something unseen. A silence that came and did not leave. And Pharaoh, who had hardened his heart again and again, finally broke. In the middle of the night, he summoned Moses and Aaron. Leave, he said. Go. Take your people. Take your animals. Take your God. And bless me also. There was no triumph in Moses' eyes, no joy in the moment, only gravity. It was over. After generations of silence, the Hebrews were free. They gathered quickly, their bread not yet risen, their hands still trembling. They carried with them only what they could hold, and the memory of slavery etched into their skin. But they walked, away from the cities they built but never lived in, away from the chains that shaped their childhoods, toward something unknown, but promised. They walked in silence at first, not because they weren't glad, but because it didn't feel real yet. Every step away from Egypt felt like a dream they didn't dare speak aloud. They had never walked freely before, never known a sunrise that didn't begin with a whip. There were old men who wept quietly, children who asked their mothers if this was what heaven looked like, women who gripped the hands of their daughters as if letting go might pull them back into bondage. And Moses led them, not with maps or armies, but with presence, with faith. By day, a pillar of cloud guided them. By night, a pillar of fire lit the path. They didn't know where they were going, but the cloud moved, and so they followed. But Egypt wasn't done. Pharaoh's sorrow turned to rage. What have we done? He asked his officials. We've let them go. We've lost our slaves. He gathered his army. Chariots gleamed in the sun. Horses stamped the earth. And they rode hard, the full force of Egyptian might, chasing the backs of broken people. The Hebrews camped by the sea. They heard the thunder of hooves before they saw the dust. And then, panic. "Why did you bring us here to die?" they cried to Moses. "Were there no graves in Egypt? We told you to leave us alone." But Moses stood firm. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Stand still and see the deliverance the Lord will bring today." Behind them, the enemy approached. Before them, waves stretched endlessly. And then, the cloud moved. It slid between the camp and the army, casting light on one side and darkness on the other. Egypt could not move forward. And Moses lifted his staff. The wind began to howl. The sea did not roar open like a sudden storm. It peeled back slowly, steadily, as if creation itself was responding to something ancient and sacred. The waters divided, rising like walls on either side, and between them, a path of dry ground stretched forward under moonlight. The people stared in awe. Then, one by one, they stepped in. Fathers carrying children, mothers holding baskets, elders leaning on trembling legs. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They moved forward in silence, the sound of their sandals muffled by the sand and the wind. On either side, water towered higher than any wall they'd ever built. But they didn't look back. They walked. All night long, they crossed. Behind them, Egypt gave chase. Pharaoh's pride had not died. He sent his chariots into the sea, his warriors into the same passage the Hebrews had just entered. But the ground beneath their wheels began to shift. Wheels jammed, horses bucked, panic spread. And then, Moses reached the other side. He turned. He looked back one last time at the empire that had owned his past. Then he stretched out his hand. The waters crashed. Stone and bone sank together. The sounds of pursuit were swallowed. And the dawn rose on something the Hebrews had never seen before. Freedom. True, terrifying, beautiful freedom. They stood on the shore, wind in their hair, sea spray on their faces, and wept. Some fell to their knees. Some sang. Some simply stared at the horizon, unsure what to do with their hands no longer holding burden. But all of them knew. This was a beginning. The sun rose warm on faces not bent by labor. For the first time in generations, the morning did not begin with commands. No bricks to shape, no quotas to fill, no masters shouting their names like insults. Just breathe, just sky, just silence. They were free, but freedom, they would learn, is not a destination. It's a path. And that path led not into comfort, but into the wilderness. The desert was vast, open, and unfamiliar. It held no walls, but also no certainty. No chains, but no shelter. The people walked in clumps, still in disbelief, carrying what little they had and what couldn't be seen: fear, hope, memory. They looked to Moses, the man who had defied Pharaoh, parted seas, and stood between them and death. But Moses was quiet now. He knew this was only the beginning, because freedom brings questions. Where will we eat? Where will we sleep? How do we live when no one is telling us how? The first night in the desert, they huddled together, unsure whether to rest or remain alert. The stars stretched over them like witnesses. And for the first time, fathers told their sons not about what they had to do tomorrow, but about the God who had set them free. Not with weapons, not with army, but with signs, with patience, with a plan that began long before any of them were born. And in the days to come, as hunger crept in and thirst cracked their lips, they would start to murmur again, because even the free sometimes long for the predictability of bondage. But for now, They lay down, on open ground, under open sky, and they slept, not in fear, but in something that felt almost like peace. In the wilderness, time moves differently. There are no clocks, no bells, no shifts to change, just sun and shadow, heat and cold, hunger and silence. Days stretch long and heavy. Nights settle like a thick, unfamiliar blanket. The Hebrews walked, and with each step, they left behind more of Egypt, but not all of it. Egypt still lived in their habits, in their doubts, in their fears. Chains, once broken, don't vanish. They leave marks. They echo. Some longed for the past, not because it was good, but because it was known. At least there we had food, they said. At least there we knew what each day would bring. Moses heard their complaints, and once again, he turned to the God who had brought them this far. And once again, God answered. Each morning, they awoke to something new. Thin flakes on the ground, soft and strange. They called it manna. What is it? Because they didn't understand it. But it fed them, gently, daily, just enough for that day. And when they thirsted, Moses struck a rock, and water poured out. Miracle after miracle, quiet but real, followed them. But still they doubted. Still they feared. Because freedom is harder than slavery in one brutal way. It asks you to trust. Trust in a path you can't see. Trust in a promise not yet fulfilled. Trust in a leader who once stuttered and now speaks for God. And Moses was tired. He carried not only his own burdens, but the weight of a nation. He climbed hills alone to speak with God. He came down with answers and rules and reminders and eyes that had seen fire. The people didn't always understand him, but they followed, because the fire still burned in the sky at night, and the clouds still moved before them by day. And somehow, that was enough. They began to change. Slowly, like stones reshaped by years of water. The people who once cowered under whips began to walk with straighter backs. Their voices, once used only for whispers and groans, began to rise in song. Children who had only known stories of slavery began to hear stories of freedom, told around fires under open sky. They were not a people yet, not fully, but they were becoming one. They learned to gather. They learned to rest. They learned to trust, not completely, not all at once, but enough to keep walking. And in the heart of the wilderness, something sacred happened. Moses climbed a mountain. He left the camp and ascended alone into cloud and wind and silence. There God spoke, not through plagues, not through fire, but through words, commandments. Not to bind, but to guide, not to control, but to protect. Words carved in stone, yet meant for hearts. You shall have no other gods before me. Remember the Sabbath. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not kill. Instructions for a free people learning how to live without chains. While Moses was on the mountain, the people waited. And in their waiting, they grew restless. They built an image of gold, a calf, a false god, shaped by hands that still remembered idols. They danced, they bowed, and Moses, descending with the law of heaven in his hands, saw them. His heart broke. The tablets shattered. But the story did not end there. Because even in betrayal, even in brokenness, God was not done. He called Moses again. He gave new tablets. He renewed the covenant, not because they deserved it, but because mercy always walks beside justice, and freedom is not built in a day. Moses came down the mountain changed. His face shone, literally, with the light of the one he had met. The people were afraid to look at him, not because he was angry, but because he radiated something they didn't understand. Holiness is unsettling even when it's gentle. He veiled his face when he spoke to them out of kindness, and he began to teach, not just rules, but rhythms, patterns of life designed for people who were learning to live again, instructions for justice, for care, for rest, festivals to remind them of where they came from, sacrifices to mark the cost of forgiveness, laws to build a society not on domination, but on remembrance, because memory was everything. If they forgot who they had been, slaves, they would lose the meaning of freedom. If they forgot the God who rescued them, they would trade a golden calf for another master. So they built, not cities for Pharaoh, but a tabernacle for God, a tent of meeting constructed not with forced labor, but with willing hands. Gold and silver were brought, not stolen, but given. Fabrics woven, wood carved, oil prepared. Every detail sacred. When it was finished, they stood before it in silence. Then the cloud descended, and the glory of God filled the tent, not far above, not distant, but near, among them. And that truth, God with them, became their compass. Wherever the cloud lifted, they moved. Wherever it settled, they stayed. No maps, no landmarks, only presence. And still, they questioned. Still, they feared. Because it's one thing to leave a land. It's another to let go of what that land taught you to believe about yourself. They wandered. Not because they were lost, but because they needed time. Time to unlearn the voice of Egypt. Time to believe they were more than what had been done to them. Time to become a people, not just a crowd escaping something behind them. In the desert, there were no shortcuts, just sand, sky, and the long work of transformation. Some days were full of wonder. Manna appearing again, water bursting from rock, songs echoing through the camp as families gathered beneath tents. Other days were heavy, heat pressing down, disputes rising up, exhaustion settling in like dust. And through it all, Moses remained. He listened. He judged disputes, he answered questions. He sat with the people from dawn till dusk, until his arms ached and his soul felt worn. But still, he believed. Even when they didn't. Even when they said, "Let's go back to Egypt." Even when they cried, "We had meat there. We had garlic." At least we knew what to expect. Because that's the strange thing about freedom. It doesn't always feel safe. Bondage, for all its cruelty, is predictable. But the wilderness? It asks you to wake each day, not knowing what will come, only that you are no longer who you were. And that is terrifying, and holy, and necessary. And slowly, quietly, beautifully, their hearts began to change. Not all at once, but enough that when they looked back, they no longer saw home, only chains. As the years passed, the desert became something else. Not a place of exile, but a teacher. It taught them how to wait, how to listen, how to follow without seeing the end. Children who had never laid bricks under a whip learned how to gather manna. Teens who'd never seen a pyramid learned to walk by firelight. New songs were written, songs not of sorrow, but of survival, of strange hope rising in the heat. And Moses aged. His beard turned white. His steps grew slower. But his eyes remained sharp, not because of what they saw, but because of what they remembered. He carried the whole journey in his heart. Every cry, every complaint, every moment when he stood between a people and their God. He had once doubted himself, once begged God to send someone else. But now, when he climbed a hill to pray, he did it with the steadiness of a man who had come to trust his calling, even when it hurt. And it did hurt. Because freedom isn't a finish line. It's a burden, a gift. a weight that you carry not alone, but together. There were still arguments, still days of fear, still reminders of Egypt buried in old habits. But there was also laughter. There were moments when children danced in the dust, moments when a father told his son about the sea opening wide, moments when a grandmother laid under the stars and whispered, "We were once slaves, and now we are not." That is freedom. Not perfect, not painless, but real. And slowly, it began to feel less like escape and more like becoming. There came a day when the horizon finally changed. After years of dust and wandering, after funerals and new births, after doubts and miracles, the clouds stopped near a river. Across its waters was the land they had heard about in whispers, the land of promise. A place not of pyramids, but of vineyards. Not of taskmasters, but of rest. But Moses would not enter it. God had already told him. He had led the people through the hardest part, the breaking, the shaping, the becoming. But the final step would not be his. So Moses climbed one last mountain. He stood alone and looked across the river, eyes scanning the hills, the valleys, the trees. He saw, not with regret, but with peace. Because he understood now, his journey had never been about arrival. It had been about obedience. He had led slaves into freedom, taught them to trust, taught them to walk. And that was enough. He died there, on the mountain, in the presence of the God who had called him from fire. And the people mourned. They wept for him, not just as a leader, but as the voice that had spoken when no one else dared, as the hands that had lifted a staff and parted seas, as the heart that had carried them when they could not carry themselves. Then they rose. Because grief was part of the journey too. They crossed the river. The land was waiting. But they would never forget the desert, never forget Egypt, never forget the long road between bondage and breath, because that road had shaped them. And freedom, they had learned, isn't just something you're given, it's something you grow into. Long after the tents were packed and the fires burned low, the stories remained. Fathers told sons about the bricks they once molded with bleeding hands. Mothers told daughters how they used to cry in silence, afraid their children would be taken. Elders sat by the evening fire, their eyes distant, speaking slowly of plagues and parting seas and the day the world changed. And the children listened, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Because memory is sacred. It is what keeps freedom alive after the battles are over. It is what reminds you of who you are and who you must never become. You were slaves, they would say. Never forget it. You were strangers. Never mistreat the stranger. You were broken. Never use your strength to break others. And those words became more than stories. They became commandments, etched not just in stone, but in identity. They built homes, not on sand, but on remembrance. Every spring, they gathered for a meal, the Passover. They ate bitter herbs and unleavened bread. They retold the story. They wept again. They sang again. They remembered the night they were passed over, the night death moved through Egypt and freedom was born in silence. And somehow, in every telling, the story remained alive. Because freedom is fragile. It must be guarded, nurtured, passed on. Not just as a right, but as a responsibility. And so they remembered, not with pride, but with gratitude. Not with arrogance, but with awe. Because they knew they had not freed themselves. They had been rescued. And still, even with their freedom secured, the scars remained. Not visible ones, but the kind you carry in your posture, your habits, your thoughts. The kind passed down quietly, generation to generation, Slavery had ended, but the memory of it lingered. In the way they measured their food, in the way they looked over their shoulders, in the way they hesitated to trust joy fully. But those scars did not define them. They became reminders. Reminders of what had been overcome, of what had been endured, and of the one who had walked with them through it all. He had not come with noise and spectacle. He came in whispers, in fire, in manna, in mercy. He came through leaders who didn't feel worthy. He came through small acts of obedience that shook empires. And in remembering him, they remembered who they truly were. Not slaves, not victims, not wanderers, but chosen, beloved, called. Each morning, when they rose and saw the sky, they did so not as survivors of Egypt, but as stewards of a promise that their lives were meant for more, that justice mattered, that kindness mattered, that memory mattered. And so they built a life that honored the wilderness. Not just the pain, but the beauty of it, the way it had stripped them down to what was true, the way it had held them in silence until they heard something deeper than fear, the way it had taught them to see light, not just as the absence of darkness, but as the presence of something sacred. In the quiet moments, long after the journey had ended, they would sit under stars and remember. Not just the drama of escape or the terror of the plagues, but the soft, unnoticed miracles. The ones that didn't make noise. The ones that came like dew. The way their sandals never wore out. The way water came from rock. The way fire led them by night and cloud by day. The way mercy followed them, even when they complained, even when they rebelled, even when they forgot. Because that's what freedom really was. Not the absence of chains, but the constant presence of grace. A grace that didn't demand perfection, only trust, only return, only remembrance. And as they taught their children, they didn't point to heroes. They pointed to God, to the one who heard their cries, to the one who waited patiently as they struggled to believe, to the one who didn't just deliver them from Egypt, but stayed with them through every dusty step afterward. The story wasn't about strength. It wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't even about Moses. It was about a people who were broken and afraid, and a God who refused to leave them there. And that story became their identity. They were once slaves, and now they were free. And they would never stop telling it. And now, the story rests. Not in silence, but in stillness. In the soft hush that follows a journey long and hard, filled with valleys and fire, with water and sky. The people who were once not a people had found their name again, not given by kings, but whispered by God, beloved, free, remembered. They no longer shaped bricks under whips. They shaped futures with their words, their customs, their prayers. They gathered each year, not out of habit, but out of reverence, to remember that what they had was not earned, but given. And in that remembering, something holy happened. The past did not chain them, it shaped them. The pain did not own them, it deepened them. And every time they told the story, by candlelight, by fire, by song, they invited others into it. Children who had never felt a whip would still weep at the memory of it. Children who had only known freedom would still grow quiet when the tale began. Because some stories are too sacred to forget. They are not about history, they are about identity, about who we were, who we are, and who we are becoming. So tonight, if you lie in your bed with questions, with burdens, with ache in your chest or doubt in your heart, let this story rest beside you. Let it remind you that even the most broken beginnings can lead to freedom, that even wandering can be holy, that even silence can be full of presence, and that you too are not forgotten. You are seen. You are loved. And no matter where you are in the journey, you are not alone. Good night.